Pride is a patient architect. It does not build with brick and timber, but with the sturdier materials of silence and resentment. Its foundations are dug in the fertile ground of a single, unforgivable argument. Its walls are raised, course by steady course, with every phone call left unanswered, every holiday passed in stony absence. The mortar that binds it all is memory, memory polished by righteousness on one side, and scraped raw by hurt on the other. It is a meticulous, painstaking craft, and the structures it creates are not homes, but fortresses. They are designed not to shelter, but to repel, not to contain life, but to preserve a grievance, keeping it safe from the eroding forces of forgiveness and time. Over the years, these fortresses become indistinguishable from the people who inhabit them, their barren corridors echoing the emptiness of the heart within. For a decade, the house on Chestnut Avenue has been such a fortress, though its architecture speaks of a gentler time. It is a place built of unspoken things, where the air itself has grown thick with the weight of conversations that never happened and apologies that died on the tongue. Here, silence is not a void but a substance, a dusty, lavender-scented shroud that has settled over the furniture, dimmed the photographs on the mantelpiece, and muted the very rhythm of life. It is a silence curated by Alara, the last sentinel of a scattered constellation, a woman who has learned to measure her days not by the ticking of the grandfather clock, but by the steady, hollow ache of what is missing. She is the keeper of the relics, a knife scar on a kitchen table, a child's accidental hammer dents in the soft pine, the silver-framed ghosts of smiles from a time before the walls went up. The conflict that erected these walls was not one of roaring battles, but of mirrors. It was the clash of two fires fueled by the same stubborn pride. A father, carved from the unbending oak of principle, and a son, forged in that same fire, determined to burn his own path even if it meant scorching the earth behind him. Their war was a quiet, cold one, ending not with a treaty but with the slam of a door, a sound that has echoed through the ensuing 10 years, a single, sharp percussion followed by a silence so profound it became its own terrible language. The father, Thomas, has since been laid to rest, his final regret a name he could no longer speak aloud. The son, Liam, has built a new world for himself 3,000 miles away, a life of steel and glass meticulously designed to have no memory of rolling hills or the scent of his mother's kitchen. He is a master of his own fortress, one whose modern, minimalist lines betray no hint of the old, sorrowful architecture he fled. This is a story that begins at the breaking point. It begins on the anniversary of that slammed door, the day the quiet, accumulated grief of 3,652 days finally becomes too heavy for a single heart to bear. But pressure, when it builds in the sealed rooms of a family's history, does not announce its release. It finds the weakest point, a memory, a date on a calendar, the shrill ring of a telephone, and it shatters the foundations of polite sorrow. What happens when the quiet keeper of the fortress finally falls to her knees and, instead of tending the silence, unleashes a prayer so raw and desperate it becomes a battering ram? What happens when that prayer is not for a simple return, but for demolition, a plea to shatter the very pride that has kept her world broken, to break everyone further if it means they can finally be remade? You are about to enter the house of unspoken things, on the very day its silence is about to be broken. You will stand in a sunlit kitchen in a forgotten town and bear witness to a mother's last, desperate gambit, an offering of pure, unadorned anguish to whatever heavens are listening. And you will feel the tremor of its answer, an impossible echo across a continent, as it strikes the walls of a different kind of fortress, a modern skyscraper where a son who has forgotten the language of home is about to be reminded of its grammar. This is a story about the devastating physics of family pride and the terrifying, miraculous power of a love that refuses to let it stand. The question is not whether the walls will fall, but what will be left standing in the rubble. Chapter 1. The House of Unspoken Things. The old house breathed around Alara, a slow, dusty respiration that had become the rhythm of her life. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a heartbeat, each creak of the floorboards a weary sigh. Silence, in this house, was not an absence of sound but a physical weight, a presence comprised of all the words that had gone unsaid for a decade. It settled in the corners like cobwebs and clung to the velvet curtains, heavy with the scent of lavender and regret. Today, the silence felt heavier still. Alara stood in the kitchen, her hand resting on the cool, worn surface of the pine table. Her fingers, gnarled with the gentle arthritis that came with 72 years, traced the faint knife marks and water rings, a map of a life that felt as distant as a foreign country. Here was the deep score where her husband, Thomas, had slipped while carving the Christmas turkey 20 years ago. There, the cluster of tiny dents where her son, Liam, had hammered a school project, his brow furrowed in concentration. And near the edge, a faint, flower-shaped stain from a glass of spilled juice, the ghost of her daughter Maya's laughter still echoing in the grain if you listened hard enough. They were a family once, a constellation that filled this house with light and noise. Now, the stars had scattered, and she was left alone in the cold, dark expanse. Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece in the adjoining living room, to the gallery of silver-framed ghosts. A wedding photo, black and white, Thomas looking impossibly young, his arm wrapped securely around her. School pictures of the children, all missing teeth and hopeful smiles. Then, the last complete family portrait, taken 15 years ago. Thomas, solid and proud. Maya, a teenager on the cusp of womanhood, her smile a little strained. And Liam, 18, with his father's stubborn jaw and a fire in his eyes that promised he could take on the world. He stood slightly apart from the rest, a premonition in photographic paper. That fire had been the problem. Two fires, Thomas's and Liam's, both burning with the same fuel of unbending pride. They had clashed, as an immovable object meets an unstoppable force, and the resulting explosion had fractured their world. The great silence, Alara called it in the privacy of her own mind, had begun not with a bang, but with the slam of the front door. Liam had walked out of it, his face a mask of fury and hurt, and had never truly walked back in. Thomas was gone now, taken by a sudden illness 5 years ago, the chance for reconciliation buried with him. He had died with his son's name a silent prayer on his lips, a regret that softened the hard lines of his face in his final moments. But Liam hadn't come to the funeral. A card had arrived, sterile and brief, expressing condolences from 3,000 miles away. He had built a new life in a city of steel and glass, a world away from the rolling hills and oak trees of his childhood, a world away from her. Maya was closer, just a town over, but the chasm between the siblings had created a different kind of distance. She carried the family's sorrow like a second skin. Their weekly phone calls were a carefully choreographed dance around the hollow space Liam had left behind. The phone rang, its shrill cry slicing through the quiet. Alara startled, her heart giving a hopeful, foolish leap before she chided herself. It would be Maya. It was always Maya. "Hello, dear," Alara said, her voice softer than she intended. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in. Did you get the groceries I sent over?" Maya's voice was warm but brittle, like autumn leaves. "Yes, thank you. You shouldn't have. It was the same script every week. It's no trouble. How are you feeling?" "The same as ever, dear." The house is quiet. An understatement that spoke volumes. A pause. This was the part of the dance where they both thought of the missing piece. Alara could almost hear Maya's unspoken question, the one she hadn't dared to ask in years. "Have you heard from him?" "Well," Maya said, her voice a little too bright. "I'll call you again on Sunday. David and the kids send their love." Give them a kiss for me. I will. Love you, Mom. I love you too, my dear. The line went dead, and the silence that rushed back and was more profound than before. It was in that crushing emptiness that the date on the calendar caught her eye. October 14th, 10 years. 10 years to the day since the door had slammed, since the silence had begun. Something inside Alara, a dam she had painstakingly constructed over a decade, finally broke. A wave of grief, so immense and powerful it stole her breath, crashed over her. It wasn't the gentle, melancholic sadness she lived with daily. This was a raw, agonizing ache that brought her to her knees. She didn't kneel gracefully. She collapsed, her hands pressing against the cold linoleum as if to hold herself together. Tears streamed down her face, hot and furious. They were tears for her lost boy, for her grieving daughter, for her dead husband who died with a broken heart. They were tears for every missed birthday, every holiday celebrated with an empty chair, every grandchild's milestone that their uncle knew of only through a forwarded email. They were tears for the poison of pride that had seeped into the foundations of their family and rotted it from within. Her life had become a long, quiet prayer for reconciliation, but the words had always been formal, timid, whispered into her pillow at night. Please, Lord, soften his heart. Please, bring him home. But today, formality was a luxury she could no longer afford. This was not a request. It was a desperate, primal cry from the depths of a mother's soul. God, I can't do this anymore, she sobbed, the words torn from her, raw and ragged. Her voice was a stranger's in the quiet kitchen. I am broken. We are broken. Look at us. Look at what we've become. She squeezed her eyes shut, not seeing the kitchen or the ghosts on the mantelpiece, but seeing the shattered pieces of her family scattered across the years. I don't even know what to ask for, she confessed to the silent house, to the listening heavens. I don't ask for him to come home. I don't ask for an apology. I don't ask for anything I can see or touch. I am begging you, shatter the pride. Whatever this wall is between them, between all of us, demolish it. I don't care how. Break it to dust. Break us if you have to, so we can be remade. She pressed her forehead to the floor, the scent of lemon polish and old wood filling her senses. Her prayer was no longer made of words, but of pure, unadorned anguish. It was a complete surrender, an offering of her broken heart at an altar of last resort. She laid down her own anger, her own hurt, her own quiet resentment at both her husband and her son for their stubbornness. She gave it all up. Heal us, she whispered into the floorboards. Not for me. Not for Thomas's memory. Heal them for each other. Please. Let the healing of their hearts be my miracle. She stayed there for a long time, the storm inside her slowly quieting, leaving a strange and profound peace in its wake. The tears subsided, leaving salty tracks on her weathered cheeks. She felt empty, not the aching emptiness of loss, but the clean, quiet emptiness of a vessel that has poured itself out completely. Slowly, shakily, Alara pushed herself up. Her knees ached, her body felt ancient, but the oppressive weight on her soul had lifted, replaced by a fragile, terrifying hope. As she stood, a single, determined ray of late afternoon sun broke through the gray clouds outside, slicing through the kitchen window and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It landed on the pine table, a warm, golden spotlight right on the cluster of tiny dents where a little boy had once hammered away, building something new. Chapter 2. An Echo in a Steel Canyon. 3,000 miles away, in a city that mistook ambition for a soul, Liam felt the tremor. It was not a physical thing. The polished floor of the 40th-story boardroom did not shudder. The vast, unblemished pane of glass that framed a skyline of architectural titans did not ripple. The applause from the seven-figure clients around the mahogany table was as solid and real as the deal he had just secured. It was a victory, clean and absolute. Liam, at 38, was at the apex of his carefully constructed world. He was the unstoppable force his father had always warned him about, but he had channeled it, honed it into a precision instrument. His life was a testament to control. His apartment was a minimalist masterpiece of chrome and leather. His relationships were transactional and efficient, and his emotions were filed away in a vault to which he had long ago lost the key. He accepted the handshakes, his smile a well-practiced curve that didn't reach the cool gray of his eyes. "A pleasure doing business with you, gentlemen." His voice was a calibrated instrument, projecting confidence and finality. This was his kingdom, built brick by brick on the scorched earth of his past. And then it happened. As the last client left, and the sound of the heavy glass door clicking shut echoed in the sudden quiet, the tremor hit. It was not a sound, but a seismic shift deep within him, a lurch in the tectonic plates of his own being. The breath hitched in his throat. A sudden, dizzying vertigo washed over him, and the skyline outside his window seemed to waver, the rigid lines of steel and glass dissolving for a split second into something softer, something green and sun-dappled. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles white. His colleague, Mark, was gathering papers, chattering about celebrating. "Liam? You all right, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost? No, it was more substantial than that. It was a memory, but not in the way he usually experienced them, as flat, two-dimensional images he could examine with dispassion. This was a full sensory ambush. He wasn't in the boardroom anymore. He was 8 years old. The air didn't smell of recycled air and expensive cologne. It smelled of sawdust, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet scent of his mother's oatmeal cookies baking in the oven. The table beneath his hands wasn't cold, lacquered mahogany. It was warm, soft pine. And in his hand, he could almost feel the weight of a small, toy hammer, its head wrapped in cloth by his father so he wouldn't do too much damage. Asterisk tap. Tap tap. Tap. Asterisk. The sound was so clear it was as if it were happening right beside his ear. He was building a birdhouse, a clumsy, lopsided thing for a school project. His tongue was sticking out the corner of his mouth in concentration, just like his dad's did when he was fixing the lawnmower. His brow was furrowed. The afternoon sun, the real sun, not this pale, reflected city glare, streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It lit his mother's hair as she hummed a tune at the sink, washing vegetables. The feeling that swamped him was not the fury of the argument, nor the cold sting of his father's disappointment, nor the bitter taste of his own pride. It was something he had forgotten he was capable of feeling. It was a profound, aching sense of safety, of belonging, a feeling of being a small, essential piece of a whole, hammered into place with love and patience. He could feel the dents his hammer was making in the soft pine of the kitchen table, a constellation of his own creation on the family map. "Liam." Mark's voice was sharp, cutting through the haze. Liam blinked, and the steel skyline snapped back into focus. The boardroom was cold again. The smell of sawdust was gone. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a wild, frantic bird trapped in a cage of his own making. "Yeah, sorry," he managed, loosening his grip on the table. He ran a hand over his face, surprised to find it clammy. "Just a long week. The final push on this one." Mark clapped him on the shoulder, accepting the lie. "Tell me about it." "But we nailed it. Dinner and drinks are on me tonight. The good stuff." "I think I'll pass," Liam said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "Need to decompress. Rain check." He didn't wait for Mark's reply. He gathered his briefcase with movements that felt stiff and alien, and walked out of the room, the fortress of his composure showing the first, terrifying cracks. The ride down in the silent, express elevator felt like a descent into a deeper part of himself he hadn't visited in a decade. The reflection in the mirrored walls showed a man in a perfectly tailored suit, his tie a muted silk slash of gray, his face a mask of success. But his eyes, His eyes looked haunted, like a stranger was peering out from behind them. His apartment offered no comfort. Its calculated emptiness, usually a source of peace and order, felt like a vacuum tonight. It was a space devoid of history, of accidental marks and loving dents. There were no ghosts here, and their absence was a deafening roar. He bypassed the state-of-the-art kitchen, the thought of food nauseating, and went straight to the bar. He poured 2 fingers of scotch, the amber liquid a familiar anesthetic. But as he raised the glass, the smell of the peat and smoke was tangled with the ghost scent of baking cookies, and he set it down, untouched. He walked to the window that served as his apartment's entire western wall. Below, the city sprawled, a grid of glittering lights, a circuit board of ceaseless energy. He had conquered it. He had wanted this life, this distance, this clean slate. He had told himself for 10 years that he had escaped the suffocating smallness of his past, the tyranny of his father's expectations, the weight of unspoken family obligations. But the memory of the pine table had undone a decade of careful self-deception in 30 seconds. It hadn't reminded him of what he had run from. It had reminded him of what he had lost. His phone buzzed on the granite countertop. He glanced at it. A missed call from Maya. He flinched, as if from a physical blow. Her calls were infrequent, usually timed around birthdays or holidays, tentative olive branches he consistently refused to grasp. He hadn't spoken to her, truly spoken, in years. Their communication was a trickle of sterile text messages and forwarded pictures of her children, his niece and nephew, strangers he knew only as smiling digital avatars. He swiped the notification away, the familiar guilt mixing with a new, sharper pang of something he couldn't name. He stood there for an hour, maybe more, watching the river of headlights flow through the city's concrete canyons. The silence in his apartment was different from the silence in his mother's house. Hers was a silence full of things unsaid. His was a silence of things unfelt. Finally, driven by an impulse he didn't understand and didn't want to examine, he went to his laptop. His fingers moved over the keyboard with a will of their own. He didn't search for market reports or project updates. He opened a map. The cursor blinked, waiting. With a tremor in his hand that had nothing to do with exhaustion, he typed the name of the town he had left behind. Oak Creek. The screen refreshed, showing a satellite view of the continent, a vast expanse of dark landmass. Then it zoomed and zoomed again, hurtling across plains and mountains at impossible speed. Cities blurred into towns, highways into county roads. Finally, it settled on a small cluster of green and brown, a town nestled in the crook of a river, surrounded by rolling hills. His finger traced the line of a phantom mouse on the trackpad. There was the high school, the park where he'd had his first kiss, the corner store, and there, on a street lined with old oak trees whose leaves would just now be turning to fire and gold, was a small, familiar rectangle. 312 Chestnut Avenue. He zoomed in as far as the pixels would allow, until the image of the house was a blurry suggestion of a home. But he didn't need to see the details. He knew the sag of the porch swing. He knew the crack in the third step. He knew that inside that house, in the heart of the kitchen, was a pine table covered in the faint scars of a life he had tried to surgically remove from his own. He stared at the screen, at the digital ghost of his home, and for the first time in 10 years, the 3,000 ND miles between his world and theirs felt less like a buffer and more like a wound. The prayer he didn't know had been uttered had found its mark, and the pride that had been his shield for a decade had just begun to break. Chapter 3. The Ghost of Sawdust. Sleep, when it finally came, was not a refuge. It was a treacherous landscape of half-forgotten dreams. He walked through forests where the trees were made of steel and glass, their branches scraping against a perpetually gray sky. He heard the distant, rhythmic tapping of a hammer, a sound that was both a comfort and a torment, always just out of reach. He woke with a gasp hours before his alarm, the sheets tangled around his legs, the silence of his apartment more oppressive than the noise of any nightmare. The ghost of sawdust and lemon polish still lingered at the edges of his senses. The city was already awake, its perpetual heartbeat a low thrum against his window. For the first time, it didn't sound like opportunity. It sounded like a machine. Routine, he told himself, was the antidote. Routine was the foundation upon which he had rebuilt his life. He went through the motions with practiced precision. The punishingly cold shower, the meticulously knotted tie, the black coffee he drank without tasting. He tried to force his mind back into its usual channels, to think of market fluctuations, of the Henderson acquisition, of the 1,000 tiny details that constituted his world. But his focus was a pane of fractured glass. Through the cracks, he kept seeing the sunlit dust motes dancing in his mother's kitchen. At the office, the illusion of control shattered completely. The scent of the industrial-strength cleaner the night crew used had a sharp, citrus note that ambushed him, dragging him back to the memory of lemon polish on pine. Staring at a spreadsheet, the columns of black numbers began to blur, the grid lines wavering until they resembled the soft, organic grain of wood. He could almost feel the phantom weight of the toy hammer in his palm. Mark found him staring out the boardroom window, the same window from which he had surveyed his kingdom just yesterday. Now, the towering buildings felt like headstones. "Rough night?" Mark asked, his voice laced with a genuine, if shallow, concern. "You still look a little pale. Maybe you're coming down with something." Liam didn't turn. "Maybe. Well, whatever it is, shake it off. We've got the preliminary meeting with the Tokyo investors at noon. They're Skyping in. I need you sharp." Sharp. The word resonated strangely. He had been sharp. He was a blade, honed and polished. But what good was a blade against a ghost? He had spent a decade sharpening himself, and in the process, he had ground away the boy who knew how to build a birdhouse. He had traded the simple joy of creating something clumsy and real for the complex satisfaction of acquiring things that were perfect and empty. The accusation came from a place so deep within him, he no longer recognized the voice. It was his father's, not in its tone, but in its essence. Asterisk practicality, Liam. There's no future in sawdust and daydreams. A man builds a portfolio, not a pigeon coop. Asterisk. His father hadn't been cruel, not in the way the world understood cruelty. He was a man forged in disappointment, a failed architect who sold insurance, a dreamer who had clipped his own wings and couldn't bear to see his son attempting to fly. He saw Liam's love for woodworking, the hours spent in the garage with scraps of lumber, not as a passion, but as a dangerous liability, a path toward a small life, a life like his own. The arguments had been legion, a slow, grinding war of attrition. The birdhouse project had been a flashpoint. He'd won a blue ribbon at the school fair, a small, proud moment that his father had dismissed with a tired sigh. "It's a nice hobby, son, but it won't pay the mortgage." Each word had been a nail in the coffin of that part of himself. So he had killed it. He had packed away the chisels and saws, first physically, then emotionally. He had gone to business school, as his father wished. He had learned the language of leverage and acquisition. He had become the unstoppable force, the man who built empires on paper, and he had done it all to prove his father wrong, to show him that he could build something far grander than a pigeon coop. And he had succeeded, utterly. He had a penthouse apartment instead of a mortgaged house. He had a portfolio that could withstand a global recession. And he was completely, profoundly alone, haunted by the memory of a happiness he had been taught to despise. He turned from the window, his expression hardening back into its familiar mask. "I'll be ready for the call, Mark." But he wasn't. During the video conference, as a face from halfway around the world droned on about quarterly projections, Liam's gaze drifted to the mahogany table. He ran a finger over its flawless, mirror-like surface. There were no marks here. No history. No dents from a child's toy hammer. No water rings from his mother's forgotten glass of iced tea. It was a perfect, sterile slab of wood, as dead as the tree it had been cut from. A tremor went through his hand, and he quickly pulled it back, clenching it into a fist in his lap. He feigned a headache and left the meeting early, escaping the confines of the office and the concerned glances from Mark. Back in the sterile silence of his apartment, the unopened bottle of scotch on the bar seemed to mock him. Anesthesia wasn't what he needed. He needed an anchor. His phone buzzed again. Another missed call from Maya. This time, he didn't swipe it away. He stared at her name, and the guilt was no longer a dull ache but a sharp, stabbing pain. Maya had been the keeper of the memories, the one who tried to bridge the chasm he had created. She was the one who would call and say, "Remember when we?" And he would cut her off with a polite but firm, "Maya, I'm in the middle of something." He had starved their relationship until it was a thin, skeletal thing, and still, she tried. He thought of her children, his niece and nephew. He saw their faces only in the glossy, curated images she sent. Did they know the scent of sawdust? Did they know what it felt like to build something with their own hands? Or was he the only one who had lost that? Was this generational curse of practicality, of dismissing joy for security, his father's true legacy? The prayer. The final words of the previous chapter echoed in his mind, though he hadn't written them. The prayer he didn't know had been uttered had found its mark. It felt true. This seismic shift inside him wasn't random. It was a summons, an echo answering a call he hadn't heard, a call from a life he had abandoned. He could not stay here, not one more night. This city, his fortress, had become his prison. The minimalist decor was a cell. The view from the 40th floor was a beautiful lie. The TR. Uth was in the ghost scent of baking cookies and the memory of soft pine. With a sudden, shocking clarity, Liam knew what he had to do. The decision was not logical. It was not efficient. It violated every rule of the life he had so carefully constructed. It was an act of pure, unadulterated impulse. He walked to his laptop, his movements swift and decisive. He didn't open a map this time. He opened an airline's website. The cursor blinked, waiting for a destination. Oak Creek didn't have an airport. The closest was a small regional hub in a town called Port Miller, an hour's drive away. He booked a one-way ticket for a flight that left in 3 hours. He moved to his bedroom, the closet a testament to his curated life. A row of identical gray and navy suits, a line of polished black shoes. He ignored them all. He pulled out a worn leather weekender bag from the back of the closet, a relic from a college trip he'd nearly thrown away a dozen times. Into it, he threw not a suit, but a pair of jeans he hadn't worn in years, a few t-shirts, a sweater. He packed without thinking, moving on instinct, the ghost of an 8-year-old boy finally taking control. He paused at the door, bag in hand, and looked back at the apartment. The setting sun was glinting off the chrome and glass, making the empty space look impossibly bright and cold. It was a perfect life, a magazine layout, and it had nothing to do with him. He pulled his phone out, his thumb hovering over Maya's name. He didn't call. He wasn't ready for questions, for the inevitable mix of joy and concern in her voice. Instead, he sent a text, the first non-perfunctory message he had sent her in a decade. Asterisk, something's come up. I'm coming home. Asterisk. He didn't wait for a reply. He walked out, leaving the key on the granite counter, and closed the door on his kingdom, the quiet click of the lock sounding less like an end and more like an escape. Chapter 4. The Sound of Leaving. The taxi ride was an act of severance. As the car pulled away from the curb, Liam watched the chrome and glass monolith of his apartment building recede in the rearview mirror until it was just another shard in the city's jagged skyline. For a decade, that skyline had been his compass, his validation. Tonight, it was the wall of a labyrinth from which he had just found his secret exit. The city didn't seem to notice his departure. Its lights blinked with indifferent rhythm. Its traffic flowed like blood through hardened arteries. Its low, constant hum was the breathing of a beast that would not miss one of the millions of cells living within it. He was a ghost leaving a hive of ghosts, and the silence in the back of the cab was more profound than any he had ever known in his 40th floor apartment. At the airport, he was a foreign substance. He moved through the gleaming terminal not with his usual purposeful stride, but with the tentative steps of an imposter. He was surrounded by his own kind, men and women in sharp suits, speaking urgently into phones about mergers and margins, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light of laptop screens. They possessed the hurried gait of the important, the same gait he had perfected. Yet, in his worn jeans and a sweater that felt alien against his skin, he was no longer one of them. He was a glitch in the system. He watched a man in a suit identical to the ones in his closet berate a gate agent over a 10-minute delay and felt a pang not of recognition, but of pity. What ghost was that man running from? The flight itself was a form of suspended animation. Strapped into a seat in a pressurized tube hurtling through the dark, there was nowhere to run from the thoughts he had spent a lifetime outmaneuvering. As the plane climbed, the city below transformed. The scar tissue of its grid, a map of his own ambition, dissolved into a sprawling, anonymous galaxy of light. Then, that too fell away, leaving only the profound, velvet blackness of the night sky above and the dark, sleeping country below. The memories, no longer held back by the dam of routine, began to seep through the cracks. They weren't hazy and dreamlike now. They were sharp, detailed, and painful. He was 12, not 8. The birdhouse wasn't for a school fair. It was for his mother's birthday. He had spent weeks on it in the garage, the plans carefully drawn on graph paper, the pieces of pine sanded until they were smooth as silk. He had used dovetail joints, a technique he'd learned from one of his father's old architecture books, his small hands struggling but patient. The finished product was clumsy, slightly askew, but it was made with a fierce, burning love. He remembered the pride swelling in his chest as he presented it to her in the backyard, the scent of freshly cut grass mixing with the pine. Her smile was like the sun coming out. She had hugged him so tightly, he could barely breathe. His father had watched from the back porch, a glass of iced tea in his hand. Liam had looked to him, hungry for the same approval. His father had taken a long swallow of his drink before speaking, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "The joinery is impressive for your age, son," he'd said. It was a promising start. Liam's heart had leapt, but then came the rest. "It's a fine hobby, a good way to learn discipline, but don't mistake it for a future. A man who works with his hands will always have calluses, but he'll rarely have capital. Remember that." It wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was practical. It was a lesson, delivered with the dispassionate air of a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. And Liam, desperate to be a man his father could be proud of, had listened. He had learned the lesson so well that he had forgotten the joy that necessitated it. The birdhouse had hung on the old oak tree for years, a weathered, gray monument to a part of himself he had agreed to kill. The plane began its descent, and the gentle bump of the landing gear deploying jolted him back to the present. He was a 35-year-old man, a titan of his industry, and his eyes were burning. He turned his face to the cold glass of the window, ashamed. Port Miller's airport was a single room. There were 2 gates, a tired-looking baggage carousel, and a counter for a single rental car company. The air that met him as he stepped outside was not the city's filtered, recycled breath. It was thick, heavy, and alive. It smelled of damp earth after a recent rain, of pine needles, and of the faint, clean scent of an approaching autumn. It was the smell of home, and it hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the carefully constructed man off his feet and leaving the boy standing there, lost and shivering. He rented a nondescript sedan, the keys feeling clumsy and foreign in his hand after years of being driven. The drive to Oak Creek was an hour down a 2-lane highway that unspooled through dark forests and sleeping farmland. Each mile W. As a page turned backward in a book he thought he had finished. He passed the old roadside diner with the flickering neon sign, the one where he'd had his first disastrous date. He saw the water tower on the horizon, a familiar sentinel against a sky now streaked with the first pale gray of dawn. He was driving into his own history. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A reply from Maya, sent hours ago. Asterisk home. Liam, what's going on? Are you okay? Call me. Asterisk. He ignored it. What could he say? I think I'm being haunted by the smell of your baking. I think I traded my soul for a stock portfolio, and I'm here for a refund. As he took the final turn onto Main Street, the rising sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the familiar buildings. The hardware store, the single-screen movie theater, the town library. Nothing had changed, and yet everything was different because he was the one seeing it. The town seemed smaller, slower, a world preserved in amber. He didn't drive to Maya's house on the other side of town. He didn't drive to the cemetery. On pure, unthinking instinct, he turned onto Elm Street, the street where he had grown up. He pulled the car over to the curb a block away from his childhood home and killed the engine. The resulting silence was absolute. It wasn't the empty silence of his apartment. It was a living quiet, filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of an early morning bird. He stared through the windshield at the familiar silhouette of the two-story colonial house, its white paint peeling slightly, the big oak tree in the front yard a dark, sprawling giant against the lightening sky. He could see the window of his old bedroom. He could see the porch where his father had delivered his verdict. Somewhere on that oak tree, perhaps, were two old nails where a boy's clumsy, beautiful birdhouse had once hung. The ghost of sawdust was no longer a ghost. It was in the air he was breathing, in the soil under the tires, in the very grain of this town he had fled. The impulse that had carried him 1,000 miles across the country finally exhausted itself, leaving him hollowed out and trembling in the driver's seat of a rental car. The journey was over. He had come home, and he had never felt more lost. Chapter 5. The Archaeologist of Memory. For a long time, he did not move. The engine ticked as it cooled, a sound like a metronome counting down the seconds of a life he no longer recognized. The dawn was not a dramatic city event, a flash of fire between skyscrapers, but a slow, quiet bleed of color into the gray fabric of the night. The light, the color of weak tea, seeped over the rooftops, catching on the dew-jeweled webs in the hedges and turning the damp asphalt of the road to a soft, shimmering silver. The silence was a presence, thick and palpable, broken only by the mournful coo of a distant dove. Finally, the click of the door handle sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Liam stepped out of the car, and the world rushed in. The air tasted of wet stone and fallen leaves, a clean, sharp flavor that scoured the stale taste of recycled cabin air from his mouth. A damp chill seeped through his expensive, city-soft sweater, raising goosebumps on his arms. He felt profoundly out of place, an exotic species introduced into a delicate, balanced ecosystem, his leather shoes alien on the cracked pavement where he had once skinned his knees learning to ride a bike. He walked, not with his usual brisk, commanding stride, but with the hesitant steps of a pilgrim approaching a sacred, half-forgotten shrine. The house stood before him, both intimately familiar and utterly strange. It was smaller than he remembered, the way all childhood landmarks shrink when viewed through adult eyes. The white paint he recalled as pristine was now flaking near the eaves, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath like bone showing through skin. A different car, a sensible family station wagon, sat in the driveway where his father's meticulously polished sedan used to be. A child's bright blue tricycle lay toppled on the lawn. Someone else's life was here now, layered over the foundations of his own. He was an archaeologist excavating his own past, and the topsoil was someone else's present. His gaze, however, was drawn inexorably to the oak tree. It was a giant, a gnarled patriarch whose limbs stretched over the house and the street, its leaves just beginning to blush with the first hints of autumn gold. It was the one thing that seemed unchanged, its deep-rooted permanence a silent rebuke to his own transient, rootless existence. He walked onto the damp grass, the wet blades clinging to his shoes, and approached the massive trunk. He knew the spot by heart. It was on the side facing the street, about 5 feet up, just to the right of a deep scar in the bark left by a long-ago lightning strike. He ran his hand over the rough, furrowed surface, his manicured fingers, so used to the smooth glide of a touch screen, snagging on the lichen and bark. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. He was afraid. Afraid he wouldn't find them, that the memory was a fabrication, another ghost. Afraid that he would find them, and that the ghost would become real. His fingertips brushed against something hard, metallic, and cold. He scraped away a piece of loose bark. There it was. A single, rust-pitted nail, its head almost swallowed by 2 decades of the tree's slow, patient growth. He searched a few inches to its right, his breath held tight in his chest. And there, the second one. They were a ghost skeleton, the last physical evidence of the boy he had been. The boy who believed that love could be built with pine and dovetail joints. He leaned his forehead against the cool, rough bark, closing his eyes. The memory wasn't just a thought anymore. It was a physical object lodged in his throat. He could feel the splintered wood under his small hands, smell the sharp, clean scent of the pine shavings. He could feel the fierce, uncomplicated pride of creation. It was a feeling so pure, so potent, that his current life, with its multi-million-dollar deals and corner office views, felt like a pale imitation of success. His father's words echoed again, not as a memory, but as a live broadcast from the past. A man who works with his hands will always have calluses, but he'll rarely have capital. He looked at his own hands. They were smooth, the nails clean and perfectly shaped. The hands of a man who signed checks, who shook on deals, who typed out directives. The hands of capital. They felt useless now, foreign and weak. His father had calluses, not from woodworking, but from the relentless grip on the tools of his own ambition. The pens, the briefcases, the steering wheel on his long commutes. He had taught his son to trade the calluses of creation for the calluses of acquisition. And Liam, the good son, had made the trade without ever understanding the cost. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, washed over him, and he had to swallow hard against it. Liam? Liam Pierce, is that you? The voice was thin and reedy, cutting through his reverie like a shard of glass. He flinched, pulling away from the tree as if caught in a crime. He turned, blinking in the strengthening light. An elderly woman stood on the sidewalk, wrapped in a pink housecoat, a small, fluffy white dog on a leash yapping at her feet. She was peering at him through thick glasses, her face a road map of familiar wrinkles. Mrs. Gable, he managed, his voice hoarse. Her face broke into a wide, delighted smile. I knew it. I told Henry the first saw a strange car, but I recognized you the moment you got out. Lord, look at you, all grown up in a fancy sweater. She shuffled closer, the little dog dancing around her ankles. What on earth are you doing here at this hour, staring at the old Henderson place? Giving the tree a hug. The Henderson place? The name was foreign. Oh, that's right, you wouldn't know. Your parents sold it years ago, after your father retired and they moved to Arizona. The Hendersons bought it. Nice young family. He's a doctor over at the regional hospital. She gestured with her chin toward the tricycle on the lawn. The information landed with a quiet thud. Of course, he knew they had moved, but standing here, it was a truth he hadn't let himself feel. The house wasn't his anymore in any sense. It was just a building on a street. The past was not preserved here. It had been sold off, like any other asset. I was just passing through, he lied, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. Mrs. Gable's eyes, magnified by her glasses, were sharp and missed nothing. Passing through from the city all the way to Elm Street at sunrise. You always were a terrible liar, Liam. You look like you've seen a ghost. He didn't answer, just offered a weak, tired smile. Are you here to see Maya? She asked, her tone softening with a sudden, intuitive kindness. The name jolted him again. Maya. The text message he had ignored. The reason, he suspected, that the ghost of sawdust smelled like cinnamon and yeast. I'm not sure, he said, the honesty of it surprising him. Well, you should, Mrs. Gable said with conviction. She'll be at the bakery by now. Has been for hours, that girl. Works herself to the bone. Took over old Mr. Abernathy's place when he retired, you know. It's called the Rolling Pin now. Best cinnamon rolls in the county. Your mother would have loved them. She patted his arm, her hand surprisingly strong. Her touch was a small, warm anchor in the disorienting sea of his return. You look tired, dear. Go get some coffee. Go see the girl. She gave him another kind, searching look, then tugged on the leash. Come on, Snowball. Let's let the man be. She shuffled away down the sidewalk, leaving Liam alone once more in the quiet morning. He stood there for another minute, the oak tree at his back, the strange family's house in front of him. The journey that had started with a frantic, impulsive flight was over. But Mrs. Gable had, without knowing it, just given him a new destination. A name and a place. The Rolling Pin. Maya. The ghost of sawdust had led him home, only to show him that home was gone. But maybe, just maybe, the smell of baking could show him where to go next. He turned away from the house and the tree, the two rusty nails of fresh, aching wound in his memory, and walked back to his car. The sun was now fully above the horizon, and for the first time in a decade, Liam Pierce had no plan, no agenda, and no idea what the day would hold. He only knew he had to drive to Main Street. Chapter 6. The Rolling Pin. The drive to Main Street was a journey of only 5 blocks, but it felt like traversing decades. The car, a hermetically sealed capsule of conditioned air and silent, expensive leather, insulated him from the town he was seeing again for the first time. It was like watching a film of his own life, projected onto the familiar screen of the shop fronts and sidewalks. He passed Miller's Hardware, its sign faded but still there, a steadfast anchor of practicality. The old cinema, the Majestic, was gone, its grand marquee replaced by the sterile, backlit logo of a corporate bank. He felt a pang of loss for something he hadn't even realized he missed. The sticky floors, the smell of stale popcorn, the shared darkness where he'd held Maya's hand for the first time during a summer blockbuster. Main Street was a timeline laid bare. New, trendy little boutiques with clever, pun-filled names nestled between the steadfast storefronts of the town's institutional memory. The post office, the pharmacy with its ancient, stoic mortar and pestle sign, the dusty windows of a law office that had belonged to the same family for 3 generations. The world had moved on, but here, it had done so selectively, leaving layers of the past visible beneath the new paint. He spotted it easily. It was exactly where Mrs. Gable had said, in the space that had once been Abernathy's fine breads, a place of hushed reverence where the old man, perpetually dusted in flour like a benevolent ghost, would sell dense, dark rye loaves to Liam's mother. The old, stained gold lettering was gone. In its place was a sign of carved and painted wood, whimsical and inviting, the Rolling Pin. Below it, in a cheerful script, bakery and cafe. The large front window was steamy with condensation, a warm, living breath against the cool morning air. Through the cleared circles and the steam, he could see the soft, golden glow of interior lights and the dark silhouettes of people moving within. He didn't park in front. He couldn't. Instead, he pulled into a spot across the street, killing the engine and sinking back into the silence of the car. The ticking of the cooling engine returned, the same sound he'd heard in front of the house. Only now it felt less like a countdown and more like the frantic beating of his own heart. He was an observer, a spy in his own past. He watched as a man in a construction vest came out, juggling a coffee and a large paper bag. He saw a woman push a stroller up to the door, a toddler's face pressed against the glass. This was a place of routine, of community, a central hub in the daily life of a town he no longer belonged to. What was he doing here? The question, which had been a low hum of anxiety since he'd fled the city, was now a deafening roar. He had come chasing the ghost of a memory, of a feeling of loss he couldn't name. He had thought finding the nails in the tree would be an answer, an exorcism. Instead, it had only deepened the wound. And now he was here, about to confront a different kind of ghost, a living one. A woman he had left behind with the same casual, thoughtless ambition with which he had left everything else from this life. He remembered their last conversation, a strained, static-filled phone call. He was in his dorm room, surrounded by textbooks on corporate finance. She was talking about art school applications. Their worlds were already diverging, tectonic plates shifting to form a chasm he hadn't had the foresight or the courage to bridge. He had promised to call back. He never did. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. Smooth. Useless. He imagined her hands. Were they covered in flour? Did she have burns on her arms from the ovens? Did she have calluses? The thought shamed him. He had run toward capital, and she, it seemed, had stayed with creation. 10 minutes passed. 15. The sun was higher now, its light sharper, burning away the soft gray of the dawn. The world was waking up, and he couldn't hide in the pre-dawn shadows any longer. Taking a breath that did little to calm the tremor in his chest, he opened the car door. The air on Main Street smelled different from the air on Elm Street. Here, the scent of damp earth and leaves was overpowered by a rich, complex perfume, roasting coffee, diesel from a passing truck, and a warm, sweet, yeasty aroma that seemed to emanate directly from the heart of the rolling pin. It was the scent of cinnamon Mrs. Gable had promised, and it pulled him forward, an invisible thread tugging him across the street. A small bell, a real one, made of brass, tinkled cheerfully as he pushed the door open. The sound was a declaration, an announcement of his intrusion. He was immediately enveloped by a wall of warmth and scent, a dense, humid cloud of baking bread, the sharp sweetness of cinnamon, and the dark, bitter promise of fresh coffee. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault that bypassed his brain and went straight to some older, more primitive part of his memory. The inside was nothing like the sterile, minimalist coffee shops he frequented in the city. It was cozy, a little chaotic, and deeply, authentically alive. Mismatched wooden tables and chairs were scattered around the room. The walls were a warm yellow, adorned with paintings by local artists. Behind a long counter overflowing with pastries, scones, and muffins sat a massive, gleaming espresso machine, hissing and steaming like a friendly dragon. A menu was written in colorful chalk on a huge blackboard, and behind that counter, a woman was moving with the fluid, economic grace of someone who was master of her domain. It was Maya. He would have known her anywhere. She was older, of course. The soft, teenage roundness of her face had given way to the elegant lines of a woman's. There were faint, fine lines around her eyes, the kind that come from smiling. Her dark hair, which he remembered as a long, wild mane, was pulled back in a messy but efficient bun, with loose tendrils escaping to frame her face. She wore a simple gray t-shirt and a white apron that was not pristine, but bore the smudges and smears of an honest day's work. Her hands, when she turned to wipe one on a cloth, were dusted with a fine constellation of flour. She was laughing at something a customer, a burly man in a flannel shirt, had said. Her laugh was the same, a low, throaty sound that had always made him feel like he was sharing a secret. For a moment, he was paralyzed, caught in the doorway between his past and her present. He was a ghost at the feast, watching a life that had continued, had flourished, without him. The man in the flannel shirt moved away with his coffee, and for a beat, her eyes scanned the room. They passed over him, then flicked back, a slight, almost imperceptible double-take. Her smile faltered. The laughter faded from her eyes, replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated confusion. Her brow furrowed, and she tilted her head slightly, as if trying to make sense of an image that did not belong. He knew he had to move, to speak. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing between them. He walked forward, his expensive leather shoes feeling loud and foolish on the worn wooden floor. He stopped at the counter. Up close, he could see the dusting of flour on her eyelashes. He could smell the cinnamon on her clothes. Maya, he said. Her name felt strange on his tongue, a word he hadn't spoken aloud in over a decade. Her eyes, a deep, warm brown he had never forgotten, widened. The recognition was complete now, washing over her face in a wave of shock. Then something else he couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't happiness. It was something more complex, more guarded. Liam. Her voice was a whisper. Liam Pierce. She said his full name as if to convince herself it was real. My God. What on earth are you doing here? He opened his mouth to answer, to offer the lie he'd given Mrs. Gable. Asterisk just passing through asterisk, but the words wouldn't come. Looking at her now, so real and solid in her world of warmth and flower and creation, any lie felt like a profanity. He had no excuse, no explanation that would make any sense. He had chased a ghost of sawdust halfway across the country, only to find himself standing in a cloud of flour, utterly and completely lost. I don't know, he said, and it was the most honest thing he had said in years. Chapter 7. The Taste of Cinnamon. The silence that followed his confession was not empty. It was filled with the hiss of the espresso machine, the quiet clinking of ceramic mugs, the distant murmur of another customer's order. For a moment, the entire bustling life of the bakery seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Maya's response. He felt exposed, stripped bare under the warm, flour-dusted lights, his decade of carefully constructed self-assurance dissolving into the humid air. Maya's guarded expression softened, not into warmth, but into a kind of weary empathy. She leaned a hip against the counter, crossing her arms over her flour-smudged apron. It was a defensive posture, but her eyes held a clinical curiosity, the look of a craftsman examining a piece of wood for flaws before deciding what to do with it. You don't know, she repeated, her voice no longer a whisper but a low, even tone that carried a hint of irony. The man who had a 5-year plan before he could even legally drink. The man who mapped out his entire life on a napkin in a booth at Miller's Diner. That Liam Pierce doesn't know why he's standing in a bakery in a town he couldn't wait to leave. Her words weren't an accusation. They were a statement of fact, a simple laying out of the profound contradiction he presented. He winced. He remembered that napkin. He remembered the arrogant certainty. That napkin didn't account for a lot of things, he managed, the words feeling inadequate. A young barista with pink hair and a nose ring glanced over. Her curiosity piqued. Maya gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The girl immediately became intensely interested in polishing the stainless steel milk frothing wands. Look, Maya said, her voice dropping further. This is a little public. I've 100 things to do. The morning rush isn't going to bake itself. She gestured with her head towards a small, unoccupied table in the far corner, nestled by a window that looked out onto a tiny alley garden. Get a coffee. Sit. I'll take my break in 10 minutes. It was a dismissal and an invitation all at once. It was practical. It was so perfectly her. He nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. He moved toward the counter where the pink-haired girl was now studiously avoiding his gaze. Just a black coffee, please, he said. His voice sounded hoarse. As she prepared it, his eyes drifted over the bounty under the glass. Croissants, burnished and flaky, scones studded with berries. And there, on a large platter, were the cinnamon rolls Mrs. Gable had spoken of, enormous, spiraled things, heavy with sticky glaze and the scent that had pulled him across the street. He carried his coffee to the corner table and sat. The chair was wood, solid and a little scarred. He wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic mug, the heat a small comfort. From this vantage point, he could watch her work. She moved with a beautiful, practiced efficiency, a dance between the ovens, the cooling racks, and the front counter. She was completely in her element, the undisputed heart of this warm, fragrant world she had built. He was the foreign object, the particle of dust in the otherwise smooth-running machine. He had built a life on spreadsheets and market projections, on abstract numbers that represented wealth. She had built a life from flour, water, yeast, and sugar. He could feel the profound, qualitative difference between their creations in the very air he was breathing. True to her word, she appeared at his table 10 minutes later, holding a mug of her own and one of the cinnamon rolls on a small plate. She placed the pastry between them, a buffer, an offering, a centerpiece, and sat down. "So," she began, taking a sip from her mug. "My God, Liam. It's been, 12 years? 13 this fall," he corrected automatically, then felt foolish for having kept such precise track. She nodded slowly. 13. Right. You look successful. She said the word without judgment, but it landed on him with the weight of one. He was wearing a $4,000 suit, even if he ditched the tie. It was a costume, and it suddenly felt ridiculous. "My father passed away a few months ago," he said, deciding that the simple, unvarnished truth was the only path forward. "I came back to clear out the house on Elm Street." Her expression shifted again, the weary guardedness replaced by genuine sorrow. "Oh, Liam, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Your mom? She passed 5 years ago. Cancer." "I'm so sorry," she said again, and this time her voice was soft with an old, familiar kindness. A silence fell between them, heavier than the first. The ghosts of his parents had joined them at the small table. "Clearing out the house," he continued, needing to fill the space. "It's an archaeological dig. You find things you'd forgotten you ever had." He paused, looking down at his smooth, useless hands, then back up at her. "I found the box. The one we buried under the loose board on the porch." Maya's eyebrows rose in surprise. A flicker of a smile, the first he'd seen directed at him, touched her lips. "The time capsule? With the concert ticket stub and that ridiculous photo of us with ice cream on our noses?" "That's the one," he said, a ghost of a smile finding his own face. "And the carving you did. Of the tree." "The old oak," she said, her gaze becoming distant, looking past him and into a shared memory. "I went to see it," he said, his voice quiet. "The oak tree. I don't know why. I just had to. And our initials are still there. MC plus LP. The heart you carved is almost completely gone, swallowed by the bark. But inside the letters, someone had hammered nails. Dozens of them. Old, rusty nails, hammered in so deep you could barely see the heads." He watched her face for a reaction, but she just looked at him, her expression unreadable, waiting for him to continue. It broke something in me, Maya. Seeing that. This perfect memory, vandalized. I felt this incredible sense of loss. Not just for us, but for everything. I came back here chasing that feeling, thinking if I understood the nails, I'd understand the emptiness. It sounds insane, I know. He finally stopped, his confession hanging in the air between them, smelling of coffee and cinnamon. Maya was silent for a long moment, staring at the pastry on the plate. She reached out and broke off a small piece of the roll, her fingers sure and steady. "It wasn't a stranger, Liam." He blinked. "What?" "The nails," she said, looking up at him. "I put them there. Of all the possible explanations, bored teenagers, a disgruntled neighbor, a random act of senseless destruction, this was the one he had never conceived. He could only stare at her, speechless. "It was about a year after you left," she said, her voice even. "I didn't get into the art school in Boston. My portfolio was good, but not good enough. My dad had his first heart attack. Everything just sort of fell apart. I was angry. I was so angry. At you, for being gone. At the world. At myself. And I kept walking past that tree, seeing that stupid, childish heart we carved, and it felt like a mockery. Like a monument to a life that was never going to happen. She took a breath. So one day, I took a hammer and a box of old nails from my dad's garage, and I went out there. I hammered every bit of rage and disappointment and hurt I felt into those letters. I wanted to obliterate them, to nail that memory shut, bury it under iron and rust, so it couldn't haunt me anymore. She gave a small, humorless laugh. It was very dramatic, very therapeutic, and when I was done, I went home and I started baking. I found my art somewhere else. Not on a canvas, but with this. She gestured with the piece of pastry in her hand. My hands needed to make things, not just destroy them. He stared at the cinnamon roll. The nails weren't an act of vandalism. They were an act of healing. An exorcism. He had come here chasing a ghost, only to find that the ghost had been laid to rest a decade ago, not by him, but by her. The emptiness he felt wasn't about a desecrated memory. It was about the fact that her life had not stopped when he'd left. It had changed, struggled, and then powerfully, beautifully, bloomed. The tree had grown around the nails. So had she. I never called back, he whispered. The admission was a weight dropping from his soul. No, she said simply. There was no anger in her voice, only a quiet finality. You didn't. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a ghost from his past, but as the woman she was now. The lines around her eyes were from laughter, yes, but also from worry, from squinting into hot ovens, from 13 years of life lived fully without him. He was a footnote in her story, not the co-author he had once imagined himself to be. And in that realization, the frantic, humming anxiety that had driven him across the country finally fell silent. The wound wasn't the nails. The wound was his own long absence. This place, he said, gesturing around the warm, vibrant cafe. It's incredible, Maya. You've built something real here. A genuine smile finally reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. It's just a bakery, Liam. But it's mine. He reached for the cinnamon roll, the one she had put between them, and tore off a piece. He put it in his mouth. It was warm, soft, and impossibly rich. The sweetness was immediate, but it was followed by the complex, fragrant warmth of the cinnamon, a taste that was both comforting and alive. It tasted like a home he had never known. He finished the bite, and then stood up. I should let you get back to work. She stood as well. Are you staying in town long? No, he said, and the answer was clear and certain for the first time. I'm flying back tomorrow. There's a house to sell. There's a life to get back to. They stood at the table for a moment, the boy and girl who carved a heart on a tree, and the man and woman who now stood in its place. There would be no dramatic reunion, no rekindling of an old flame. Their time had passed. The story was over, and it had ended a long, long time ago. All that was left was this postscript. It was good to see you, Maya, he said. And he meant it. You too, Liam. He walked to the door, the little brass bell announcing his departure as it had his arrival. He didn't look back. As he crossed the street to his silent, expensive car, the sun felt warm on his face. The town no longer looked like a film set of his past. It was just a town, a place where a woman he used to know had hammered her pain into a tree and then built a beautiful life out of flour and fire. He got into the car, but he didn't start it right away. He could still taste the cinnamon on his tongue, a sweet, lingering ghost. But it wasn't haunting him anymore. It was just a memory of a good thing. He wasn't going back to a life. He was simply going forward to his own. And so, Liam Pierce drove away from Main Street, the lingering taste of cinnamon on his tongue a sweet, melancholy ghost. The journey that had begun in a sterile boardroom, spurred by a seismic tremor in his soul, had not ended with the dramatic, cinematic reunion he might have subconsciously expected. There was no grand reconciliation, No tearful embrace under the old oak tree, no undoing of the years. The past could not be reclaimed. But it could. He was beginning to understand, be understood. He had come back chasing the ghost of sawdust, a symbol of a boyhood passion he'd been taught to kill, only to discover that the true creative force, the true builder in the family, was the sister he had left behind. Maya hadn't waited for him. She had hammered her grief into the heart of a tree and then used those same hands to build a world of warmth and sustenance from flower and fire. She had healed herself. He drove, not toward the regional airport, but back through the quiet, sun-drenched streets of the town. He parked on a side street, the unfamiliar rental car an anonymous gray shell. The silence was different now. It was not the oppressive emptiness of his apartment, nor the accusatory quiet of his childhood home. It was a peaceful, contemplative stillness. He pulled out his phone, his screen a stark, cold blue in the warm morning light. His thumb hovered over his contacts, over a name he had not called in 5 years, a name he had only typed into sterile condolence cards and forwarded emails. Mom. 3,000 miles away, Alara sat at her pine kitchen table, a half-empty cup of tea cooling beside her. The morning sun streamed through the window, the same determined ray of light from the day before, illuminating the dance of dust motes. The profound, clean emptiness she had felt after her prayer had settled into a kind of peaceful resignation. She had surrendered the outcome. She had given her broken pieces to God, and now she was simply waiting, breathing in the quiet rhythm of the old house. The phone rang, its shrill cry as startling as it had been yesterday. She took a breath, composing herself for Maya's morning check-in, for the familiar, gentle dance around the silence. She picked up the receiver. Hello, dear. A pause. Not the familiar crackle of Maya's car speaker, but a deeper, more distant silence, thick with unspoken years. And then, a voice she knew as well as her own heartbeat, yet one she hadn't heard, raw and unfiltered by a text message, in a decade. Hi, Mom. Alara's breath caught in her chest. Her knuckles went white where she gripped the phone. She closed her eyes, and the kitchen, the sunlight, the table, it all dissolved. It was just the voice, deeper than she remembered, weathered by time and a life she knew nothing about. But it was him. It was her son, Liam. The name was a whisper, a prayer answered. Yeah, Mom. It's me. She didn't ask where he was, or why he was calling, or what had happened. Those were the questions of yesterday. Today, there was only one thing that mattered. She leaned her forehead against the cool, smooth wood of the window frame, tears streaming silently down her face, not of grief, but of a gratitude so immense it felt like sunlight pouring into every cracked and broken part of her soul. It's so good to hear your voice, my boy, she said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. It's so good. The great miracle was not the slam of a door being reversed. It was not the 3,000 miles being erased. The miracle was this. A phone call. The sound of a voice. The simple, earth-shattering whisper of pride, broken into dust, finally allowing a son to say, Hi, Mom. The healing had not yet happened, but the ground had been consecrated. The foundation for something new, something honest and real, could now be laid, one quiet conversation at a time. Alara's prayer had been answered, not with a roar, but with a whisper that was louder than a decade of silence. And there, the story of the house of unspoken things finds its new beginning. Thank you, from the bottom of our hearts, for joining us on this journey. Thank you for sitting with Alara in her quiet grief, for feeling that tremor of change with Liam in his steel canyon, and for discovering the quiet strength of Maya in her world of flower and fire. The stories we tell here at Prayer Miracles are often like this one. They explore the truth that miracles are not always grand, earth-shaking spectacles. They are not always the parting of seas or the healing of the blind. More often, a miracle is the quiet, unseen shift that happens deep within the human heart. It is the sudden, inexplicable urge to pick up the phone. It is the courage to say, I don't know, after a lifetime of pretending to have all the answers. It is the softening of a heart hardened by pride, the breaking of a silence that has held a family captive for years. Alara's prayer was a perfect act of surrender. She didn't demand a specific outcome. She begged for a fundamental change. She asked God to shatter the pride. And in his infinite wisdom, the answer came not as a homecoming, but as a humbling. It came as a memory of sawdust and a taste of cinnamon that led to a single, grace-filled phone call. That is the nature of the miracles we so often overlook. They are the seeds, not always the harvest. They are the first crack in the dam, the first ray of light in a dark room. They are the beginning of the healing, and that, in itself, is everything. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of a quiet prayer to change a human heart, then we invite you to become a part of our community. The world can be a loud and lonely place, and stories like this remind us that we are not alone in our struggles, in our hopes, or in our faith. They remind us that even the most fractured things can be made new. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Prayer Miracles, and click that notification bell so you won't miss the next story we have to share. Every subscription, every like, and every share helps these stories of hope reach someone who might be sitting in their own quiet house, waiting for a miracle. We believe that sharing these testimonies is its own form of prayer, sending light and encouragement out into the world. Thank you again for your time and for your heart. Until our next story, may you be blessed. May you find grace in the quiet moments, and may you have the eyes to witness the miracles that begin with a single, heartfelt prayer.